Okay, so I think we're going to get started here today. Thank you everyone for joining us for creating e-learning that makes a difference. We look forward to this next hour with you. This webinar is presented by Ethan Edwards, Chief Instructional Strategist here at Allen Interactions. Also here is me, Carrie Zenz, and then joining me is Brittany Lager. And we will be moderating and answering questions through the questions panel, providing support today. So again, any questions that you have, we're in listen-only mode today. So please submit those through the questions pane. And we will get those answered for you, either through the questions pane, or we will also be answering questions throughout the hour. So I will be posing questions to Ethan to answer. So please submit your questions as we go through the hour. Just want to go over a few things today with your control panel. Everybody has audio options, telephone or mic and speakers through your computer. And then again, the questions pane area where you submit your questions. And then the tab over on the left side, you can collapse your control panel or expand it with the orange arrow. This session is being recorded today, so everybody will be getting a link to the recording following the webinar, either tomorrow or at the latest the next day. And please share any of your thoughts about today's webinar, any thoughts or ideas that you have. Use the hashtag #CustomElearning. And just getting started here today, we're going to launch a couple of polls to familiarize ourselves with everybody that's out there. We've got almost 400 people online right now. So the first poll I'm going to launch here is asking you what role you are. So just take a couple seconds and let us know. Okay, just a few more seconds here. Almost everybody's responded. Okay, so we have a lot of instructional designers on today. But we also have some executive managers and some developers and just one internal learning customer out there. So thank you everybody for sharing that. Sorry about that. I'm having technical issues here. Okay, the next poll here is we wanted to know how familiar everybody is with the CCAF model. So let us know how familiar you are with the CCAF model. Okay, and I'm going to close the poll now and share results. So a lot of people, what is CCAF? People don't know what CCAF is, so that's great. We're great. Well, that's great to hear that a lot of people on there haven't heard of CCAF, so we'll be sharing a lot about that. Ethan will be sharing a lot about that today. So thank you for sharing with us. And now just a little bit about Ethan, and I'm going to turn things over to him because that's who you want to hear from. So Ethan is the Chief Instructional Strategist here at Allen Interactions, where we design and develop custom learning solutions. He has more than 25 years of experience as an e-learning instructional designer and developer. He is responsible for the delivery of the internal and external training and communications that reflect Allen Interactions' unique perspective on designing and developing custom interactive learning solutions. He is also the primary instructor for ASTD's e-learning instructional design certificate programs and is an internationally recognized speaker on e-learning and instructional design. He is also a blogger on Allen Interaction's e-learning leadership blog and has published several white papers on how to create effective e-learning. He holds a master's degree and significant doctoral work in educational psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So now I'm going to just pass things over to Ethan.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you, Carrie, for those introductory remarks. As she said, we are here to talk about creating e-learning that makes a difference, and at the root of that is a model that we take very seriously here at Allen Interactions, which we abbreviate CCAF, which stands for Context, Challenge, Activity, and Feedback, which you see on that little insignia on your screen. I'm going to be explaining what those are, showing a lot of examples, and talking about some of the pitfalls and some of the ways that you can make this part of your own repertoire of design skills. So we've got a lot to do, so I'm going to be going through to show a lot of stuff. We'll have ways for you to follow up, so hopefully you can take notes and you can contact us later. And a lot of the examples that I'm showing will give you links to, so you can spend some time with them on your own after the session. So what we're going to do, we're first going to explore what we call instructional interactivity, and that, e-learning is characterized by a lot of clicking and moving and dragging things on the screen. There's a lot of interactivity, but as many of you know, a lot of that is wasted activity. Page turns where all you do is hit next, or oh, my screen chat's showing. Sorry about that. Hold on. I can't get my panel back out. I can't get my panel to come off hold on, folks. Yeah.
It's frozen. Hang on just a second. We're having Ethan's having a technical issue with his machine and getting his slides to show. So just be patient with us for just a minute, please.
About that, there's my GoToMeeting got frozen there for a moment. So here we are, and what we're going to do, actually to back up just for a moment, I was referring to something you couldn't see, which is this graphic in the upper right-hand corner that says Context, Challenge, Feedback, and Activity. That's what we meant by CCAF in that little poll we had, and we're going to be talking about how those elements come together to define instructional interactivity. So as I said, we're going to explore what that means. We're going to look at several actual examples. We're going to discuss what challenges there are in designing that and creating instructional interactivity, and hopefully give you some tools that you can take and apply to your own work. So first off, the title of this session was Creating E-Learning That Makes a Difference. Well, you may wonder, well, what difference are we supposed to be making? Success is measured in a lot of different ways, and for many of our organizations, part of the success is just that we can deliver e-learning more efficiently, quickly, have immediate updates. It can be accessible around the world. It can cost less to deliver. All those things are a difference. But as designers, and most of us are in the role of trying to do some good education through our activities, the difference we want to make is we want to create performance change. We want all those other things to happen too, and actually they will. It's pretty easy to achieve those operational benefits of e-learning. The challenge is how do you make it actually make a difference to your learners while you're doing that. So we want those changes to be lasting so that they stay with the learner, not just for the moments that are in the e-learning and until they pass the test. And we want them to be beneficial. We want them to actually apply to the learner's performance environment and make a difference in your bottom line, in your company, in your service, in your success as an organization. So that's what we're looking for. Now, before we get into seeing how we can do this right, I think it's important to acknowledge that there's some hurdles that are inherent in the way the industry looks at e-learning. And we sort of need to let go of some of these things before we can really succeed. One thing that I want us to sort of acknowledge is that learners don't really read extended text very effectively online. There's a lot of research that sort of checks into that, and the results are all over the board, but they go from 50 to 70% of the text that's in e-learning isn't actually read by any given learner. And a lot depends on the content and the context of that, and I wouldn't worry so much about exactly what number it is. If it's even bigger than 20%, we've got a problem because that's a significant part of the content that you want to communicate. So if people aren't reading it very effectively, we've got to figure out a different way to be our primary way to engage people in the content. Another thing is that learners' top priority, more than learning, is often to get finished. And so when they have to choose between doing the thing that's going to make them learn versus the thing that's going to get them finished, unfortunately, most learners end up taking the easy route. It's just human nature, and it's often the way we implement these things, and the way we measure success is oftentimes our LMSs are reporting completion more than having an evaluation that says, did people really learn? Another one is that the primary way that people tend to ask questions online tends to be tests. And we just need to realize that test questions are not a particularly good way to teach. They're a good way to evaluate, but it's a very different thing to evaluate versus teaching. And finally, mindless arbitrary actions, like just clicking keys, clicking next buttons, they ultimately become meaningless if they're used too frequently without having any variety or any real meaning attached to their use. These are big hurdles, and I think we need to actually formally say these things are in effect, and we need to work against them to have success. Now, well, how can we do that? We have to have people reading online, but I think one of our goals is to provide a reason for the learner to need to read before presenting textual information. If we just put text out there without any motivation, people are going to skip it. If we give them a reason to read, people can read pretty effectively. What about the top priority is getting finished? What we need to do is hold learners accountable, and we need to have consequences in the e-learning so that the correct route, that is the one where the most learning occurs, is also the one that's the most efficient route, so that the learners aren't being put in the conflict of wanting to do the right thing versus realizing, hey, I just need to get finished with this. With the testing, we need to get out of the mode of thinking that everything needs to be judged and everything needs to be reported, because some of the most useful interactivity is just there to help people explore, to test out hypotheses. And actually, it's a really good thing to make mistakes when you're learning. In fact, if you don't make mistakes, you could sort of make a claim that you're not learning anything. And so testing works against making mistakes. We want interactions that actually encourage that kind of free exploration. And finally, instead of just relying on these mindless responses, we want to figure out how we can have actions in our e-learning that are going to have real-world significance, because that's how we're going to actually get some transfer to the real world. So once we get people to perform online, we hope that that is going to transfer to when they're doing their job. So those are just some hurdles that I think we all have come across and we don't ever talk about. I just want to take that moment to say, if you felt those frustrations, it's okay, because we all are working against the same misleading sort of assumptions about e-learning that are often wrong. So what do we need to do instead? It brings us to this idea of instructional interactivity. And we use this term to differentiate just mind or time-consuming activity, hitting next, navigating, hitting buttons that don't have any particular significance, versus doing things online that lead to learning. And we have this definition, and I'm always torn about how to present this, because I fear that it's a definition doesn't mean anything until you actually know what it means already. But without having this here, it doesn't give us a good thing to refer to. So I'm going to give you this definition, recognizing that it might not make absolute sense until we see some examples behind it. But what we say instructional interactivity is interactivity that actively engages the mind. That is, you have to be processing, solving problems, recalling information, rehearsing activity, bringing new things in your mind, and then as you're doing that, it needs to be focused on doing something to do those things that are going to improve your ability and readiness to perform. Just as a quick example of a not instance of instructional interactivity, often many of you might have built a Jeopardy game online, and almost all authoring tools give you a template to let you really quickly put a Jeopardy game together. That's interactivity, but I think I would make the case that that's not instructional interactivity. It's just a mechanism for asking trivia questions. It doesn't particularly facilitate learning from those questions, and it's actually a pretty silly thing to do because the fun part of Jeopardy is someone's going to lose. When you do Jeopardy solitaire, all the interesting part of Jeopardy is removed. And so I think it's easy to get misled by taking the appearance of interactivity and think, I've done something great. But when you look behind the surface, you realize it's not really doing what this definition says. It's not actively engaging your mind to do something that's going to improve your ability and readiness to perform. So here's an example, and this is from some work that we actually did with a client. It was an organization called Operation Lifesaver. And they're an organization that's funded sort of by the railroads and by the government, the Department of Transportation, and they're focused on reducing accidents and deaths around railroad crossings. A particularly critical part of that is preventing wrecks with over-the-road trucks. About a quarter of the accidents are trucks being stopped on tracks and being either causing fatalities and a huge loss of equipment. So they came to us, and their content actually was pretty simple. These three little things you see on the screen summarize it. They had a 6-step process for what you should do when you approach a rail crossing in a truck. You should slow when approaching, remove distractions like turn off your radio, look both ways. They call it rock and roll, so you move back and forth. So you can look around your mirror to make sure you're seeing everything. Roll down your windows and listen, obey any controls, and then proceed with caution. Pretty straightforward. They also had a lot of information about all the signs that you might see near a railroad crossing. And then they had some additional information about recognizing that your stopping distance changes based on how big your rig is. Storage areas, meaning if I'm going to cross a railroad track, do I have enough space to get all the way across? Things like that. Now, what typically happens when we're presented with content like this, or when most of us as designers, the easy thing to do would be just to treat this as content delivery. And so you could present these rules, present the signs. I'm sure you can imagine what that would look like, and then follow it up with some questions. And these are some typical interactions I think you might see in a non-creative way of looking at this content. You know, when approaching a rail crossing, which is not one of the 6 steps in safe rail crossings. A, slow down. B, roll down windows. C, look both ways. D, obey controls and signage. E, turn on your headlights. Well, even without reading the content, it's pretty easy to pick out E as the right answer, and we move on. Also, could have some things like, here's some signs. You're supposed to drag these to put these in the right category to show their meaning. So what's the matter with that? That looks like a pretty good plan, huh? Well, I'll tell you what I think the problem is that it leaves a huge chasm between knowing information and being able to perform on it. Because I think actually with just that little list, any of us could probably pass a test pretty easily about what are the 6 steps. But I bet based on that, not many of us could go out and drive a truck and get it across all crossings by doing all those things under the pressure of time. And so that's the part that's missing. It lacked the performance environment. It lacked credible challenges. It what it was asking me to do has nothing to do with my performance. It's just knowledge. So what we did, we came up with another model, and I'm going to launch this. I'm only going to show you a very little bit of it because it's pretty interactive, and I'm afraid the slowness of the network won't give you an accurate picture, but I'm going to give you a link of how to get to it so you can spend some time with it on your own. But this is the application that we worked with them to come up with, and I think it really illustrates this idea of instructional interactivity well. I'm going to skip through some of the instructional stuff at the beginning, but it's talking about making all the decisions that you have to make when navigating rail crossings, and about how we have to make 3 different rail crossings, and as we make the right choices, we're going to get points and try to become part of the Hall of Fame, and if we do poorly, we may get traffic tickets, we may die actually in train wrecks. So let's see how this works. When I hit the road, I'll just pick this first trip, and you can either go in a box truck or a semi-truck. Well, everybody, of course, wants to take a semi-truck. That's where the real cool stuff happens. So let's try that. We'll do start now. And here we are driving. In a moment, you'll see it. There we are. We're driving down the road, and you can see there's a rail crossing coming up. Now I need to think about what are those things I need to do. I better start slowing down. And I can look and roll down my window and look. But you know what? I didn't do the things in the right order. I needed to stop. I didn't think about stopping in time. And here I get a traffic ticket. Citation. I ran a stop sign, a total fine of $350. So the consequences are not getting the question right or wrong. It's did I do the right thing? I'm going to start over again. Let me try that trip again. And sorry about the delay. And that's why I encourage you to spend some time with this on your own, because it really is much more direct of the time. But I'm going to slow us down here this time. Here comes our rail crossing. I'm going to roll down my windows, get ready to look, but I'm going to this time stop. I can look each way. I can do the rock and roll to see if things are in the way. I can look the other direction. It's all clear, so I'm going to go ahead and proceed through. And that time I made it straight through, and I've completed the first crossing, and my trip is going to continue. Now, I'm not going to take any further time on this, but I really would love you to spend some time with it. But you can see the huge difference between those other questions I just asked a moment ago versus being able to perform driving down the street. And because I was talking and not paying attention to my driving, you'll notice that I just got killed. I went across this train track, I didn't look in time, and the train came and creamed me because I hadn't paid attention. So it's really drawing your attention to the real life consequences. And so this is a pretty dramatic version of context challenge, activity, and feedback for showing the power of it, okay?
And Ethan, what tool was that built in?
That was built in Flash.
Okay. There were just a few questions about
Yeah.
that. So.
Anything else? Any questions came up that we want to?
Yeah, there was another one. Michael was saying that, you know, many simulation learning projects are considered to be very expensive. And in applying a concept like CCAF, he thinks that you'd have to have big budgets for that. And just asking about what kind of tools offer some easing off of the budget.
Yeah, well, it's a problem. We're actually going to mention the tool problem in just a few moments. But you know, I see the tools divided into sort of 3 categories. There's tools like Articulate that are extremely simple to use, but have somewhat limitations. And I call those productivity tools because their main value is getting stuff out quick. There's other tools that are more like Lectora and Captivate that I call development tools because they let you do more things, but they take a little bit more ingenuity to make them really do things that are out of the ordinary. They still are optimized for doing some page turner sort of stuff and some software training. But if you want to do something that isn't sort of page oriented like this example was, you can do it. You can incorporate movies and do some fancy things, but your programming options are a little limited. Things like this that have this level of specificity, you need to get to a real programming language like Flash, or another tool that we are in the process of developing, which is Zebra's apps, which hopefully you've heard of. We're really trying to address this problem so that to put the capability of building really high interactive things like this in the hands of people who are not programmers. So those are your options, and you have to make some compromises depending on where you are in the hierarchy of using those tools. Just on the screen here, if you want to go look at it, you can go to the alleninteractions.com site or the oli.org site, either of which have links to this training piece. I think you'll have fun playing around with it. And you're going to have to take my word for it that it really does work, because I know I just showed a tiny snippet of it. But we've had just really great results in implementing that and finding how it changes people's behavior. So looking at it, I want to say, well, what made it so good? Well, I think it is good because it follows so much this model, that there's context. And by context, we mean it's in a world that makes sense. The context is the fact you're actually on a road. You're driving down a highway. Things are changing. You have all the controls in the truck at your disposal. It isn't like doing an academic task of typing A, B, C, or D, and so forth. You really have, as much as possible, given the constraints of time and budget, the feeling that you're in a truck cab. The challenge, of course, is to safely get your rig across that track, and the activity or the actions you can engage in are pretty much exactly the same thing you could do if you were driving that truck. You can slow down, you can open your window, you can stop, you can turn off your radio, you can look. But those are the exact same actions that you'll need to do to be successful at the task. And the feedback, I only could show you part of the feedback, what we call the intrinsic feedback, which is the result, the direct result of your action. So, I got killed. That's feedback that I did something wrong. I got a ticket. I didn't, all those things are telling me. If you go through that in more detail, you'll find that after a couple crossings, you get a scorecard that tells you what are those 6 steps have you missed, what you could do better to have a better crossing. So those are those 4 elements: context, challenge, activity, and feedback. Just real quickly, I want to illustrate what we mean by the variety of those things, because there's always a context you're training, but you want to know if it's good or bad. Well, some of the less effective contexts are just generic backgrounds. Academic context where it's, let's make this look like a book, or let's just make it look corporate, or make it just look like our web page. What's better is something that's specific to the task, that's very visual. E-learning is a visual medium, and if we don't take advantage of those illustrations and so forth, we're leaving a lot of the possibility behind. We want to be related to the application of the skill and tap into emotions and make it personal if you can. Those are great contexts. What about the challenge? Things that we often put in a basic way of creating challenges don't really work very well, like just giving a score. That, again, feels very academic and almost punishing, and it rarely does it motivate the learner to really engage in the activity. Or compliance, if we tell the learners, the challenge to do this is you have to do it because we need to, that doesn't translate very well either. And having things that appear to be games that aren't, that are rigged against the learner, those actually backfire. What better challenges are is if appealing to the learner's sense of purpose, making progressive difficulty as you master simple skills, then suddenly make the lesson a little bit more difficult, making it real life, making it multiple steps so that people feel a sense of accomplishment as they're performing the task. What about the actions? What the bad actions are if they're rooted in the mechanics of working on a computer, because most things you're teaching have nothing to do with working on a computer. It's more about how do you have a conversation, how do you drive a truck, how do you cook a meal. Those are the things that you're trying to do, and we can't really get there if all we're doing is focusing on the mechanics of using a computer. So you want them to things that you have to think about, that you have to exert some effort in, that suggest the final application, that are trying to be meaningful. I say direct manipulation. You can do that when you have images of objects. So like in the screen of the truck, there was the radio, and you could turn it on or off by clicking the power button. You didn't have to have an arbitrary other button that said turn on the radio or go to a menu to say turn the radio on. You want to be able to directly manipulate the items. And finally, the feedback. When feedback is poor, it's sort of always focused on just if you were right or wrong rather than on the consequences. Or if it jumps in and judges you before the learner even had a chance to think about their answer. So immediate judgment often creates a poor feedback environment. And also falsely encouraging stuff, say good job, or celebratory feedback when the person has done the tiniest task gives a out of balance idea of the significance of accomplishments. And better, you want to have it intrinsic, delay it, make it very content rich, and make it honest. If you're going to fail at this task and you're going to die, then reflect that, and that's what we did there in the railroad piece. So those are the 4 pieces: context, challenge, action, and feedback. And I know that's just a snapshot of what we mean by those, but I think the examples help to show that the best. There are 2 hurdles when you sit down and say, well, I want to create this. The first is designing for interactivity, which is what we are talking about today. The other is building it, and actually Michael touched on this a moment ago with his question about the tools, because sometimes I know that you are inhibited from building what you would, designing what you'd like because you fear you don't know how to build it. And that's a bad trap to be in. So I do encourage you to become less of a victim of your tool, whichever one it might be, that you really have to master it, to do more than just open up out of the box and follow its templates. And that's true of whatever tool you're using. And I also want to really encourage you to think about using Zebra's apps, because I think it gets us out of that trap. But I'm going to spend the rest of the time really talking about the design issues. And I'm going to show an example here. This is an all-star example, I think I would say. We've used, I demoed this a lot, and I'm sorry if you have seen it, but I think it's worth really looking at because it's one of the very strongest pieces of instructional interactivity I know of. And it was written for Corning, and it was to teach employees their responsibilities as supervisors. And I'm just going to show a bit of it here. It's on the topic of substance abuse. You can see there's a little introduction that tells us the problem of substance abuse in the workplace continues to grow, forcing supervisors to more frequently deal with behavior stemming from an altered chemical state. How do you approach it? How do you know when to intervene? This module tackles difficult questions and provides a Corning process for handling this difficult workplace issue. So as we go into this, it gives us a little introduction, but immediately we are put into an interaction, a context, challenge, activity, feedback, interaction. And the context is you have these 6 employees. They have faces and names that you can see. You're looking at their records. And the challenge is that is given up here in the top. In this break room, you discover a styrofoam cup that has vodka mixed with Coke. One of your 6 direct reports is drinking on the job. Review notes on each employee for the last 3 days to detect any behaviors associated with on-the-job substance abuse. Then select who you believe was drinking. So the challenge is look through these people and find out who you think is exhibiting characteristics of alcohol abuse. You can see here Violet's 3 days of history, and she's been forgetful. She forgot about different meetings and seemed confused. She forgot to tell the team about some deadlines, and I asked her if she was hiking, and she looked at me blankly. And you notice that she has an appointment with EAP, which is the office that deals with personal counseling issues. Now, as a learner, you're faced with a number of things. That there's a challenge in front of me. I can either read about more of these users, more of my employees. I could ultimately come down here and say, I think it's Violet. Or if I don't know, I could go here to warning signs and pull up a reference to read about what are the warning signs for substance abuse. This is what I mean when one of my very first points was we could have started with this text that you see on the screen right now. We could have had 8 or 9 pages of page turning to describe. That kind of text would be skimmed and mostly not read for meaning because the learners would have no reason why they're reading it. However, if I go to it now, when I know I've got to understand by looking at characteristics which of these could be substance abuse signals, then I have a altogether different reason for reading this carefully and trying to apply it. So when we say that people don't read effectively, it is withhold the information, but you want to present it in a way that people are motivated to study it. So again, you can spend more time with this on your own, but if I pick, well, Karen here, she is claiming to have allergies, but she's stumbling and her eyes are running and she's not getting any work done. So I'm going to say that it's Karen and try to judge this. Turns out we're not judged yet. We can still work on this. Now that you've identified the person you believe to be drinking, you must decide on the appropriate actions to take. So from these 5, what you would do in this situation, if I say I'm going to discuss with the employee, I get a very rich feedback notice saying that really isn't the best idea. It's, it's saying it's too early to do that. You could get yourself into legal difficulty by accusing somebody unfairly, and then and so that's not the right thing. But notice how this also could have been information presented abstractly at the beginning. It would have far less meaning then than it does now as part of the feedback. Okay, so as we go through this, you make some choices. When you confirm with the supervisor, you'll find out that she really doesn't have all the characteristics and it's not the right choice. You go back and can continue picking it. But at any rate, I'm not going to finish this at this moment, but I hope you can see how strongly the contextual elements, the challenge, the actions, and that very content-rich feedback come together to create an interaction that's almost irresistible to continue working. In fact, I hate to be bailing out of this because this is one of the ones that most people really get addicted to. Feeling, well, that's an unfortunate choice of words, I guess, given the topic. I'm sorry about that. But it really is hard to pull yourself away from it because this is such a compelling story. But in going through that story, you can't help but learn the rules. So that's what we're talking about when we think about CCAF in instructional interactivity. Now I have several of these queued up, and I want to make sure to make you the time, see which one would be the best one to show. I'm going to show one that deals with software. While I'm queuing this up, are there other questions, Carrie, that
Yeah, there is a question. The question is from JL. He says, I'm curious if that feedback model is effective. They may choose right in the activity, but wrong in real life, which would have drastic consequences.
Well, that's true, but we can't really control what happens after the e-learning. Well, we have to try. We want to make sure that they know what the right path is. And the way that training was set up is you actually can't finish that interaction without ultimately taking the right course of action. I didn't lead you all the way through it because you can't just, unlike a lot of e-learning where you can just make wrong answers and it says, well, you've scored 20%, let's go on. This actually doesn't let you get finished until you go back and make the right choices. And so we do guarantee that the learner has experienced and made the right choices before they get finished, and we can hope that that will then transfer to the real world. Of course, you can't guarantee that, but I think it's more likely when we know they've at least done it once than in a different model.
Okay, and then one more question.
Sure.
In the CCAF model, who comes up with the context? Is that the instructional designer, the subject matter expert, developer, everybody?
Well, it's best to come up with it together because the most realistic contexts are those that are going to be most well-informed from all those people doing input. Oftentimes, a voice that is missed is people that are doing the job. Sometimes subject matter experts they know the content, but they may be a little bit separated from the actual application of that content. So you might want to get people who are recent learners who have been doing the job for a short amount of time and say, you know, what are the challenges? How do you use this? What are the most difficult things that you have encountered when you've been trying to do this task? The other thing that often comes up, you don't necessarily always come up with the context first. Sometimes the action is the thing that drives what the interaction is going to be, because you say, well, what do we have to teach people to do? Well, we need to have people carry on a conversation. Well, to do that, we're going to have them picking conversational elements, and so then let's work backwards to figure out a context in which that makes sense. But it's done in a combination between all the designers and the subject matter experts. Okay, now the one I have up in front of you right now is an area that a lot of people say, well, I get the idea, but I teach really boring content. I just have to teach these software skills, and you do the same thing over and over. How could you make that challenging? Well, I think there's a couple things that are really important that can radically transform how you teach software. The example I have on the screen was done for New York University hospitals, teaching their nursing staff to use an online record-keeping system. But there's two critical things, I think, that elevate this into really good training. The first is that the tasks and the lesson is not centered around the software, but it's centered around actions that learners are already familiar with, that they've been doing on paper. So it isn't the menu of the software, it's tasks that you have to do. You have to modify information in patient records. And once you get in there, instead of launching the software, it launches you with some patients. And I'm jumping right into the middle, but as you do this, each person going through this sort of gets to know the patients on one wing of a hospital. And they continue to do these tasks, ushering these people through their health care. For instance, this guy, Mr. Einstein, in a previous exercise had been admitted, and we entered his initial record, and now he's more coherent. He was a little unconscious earlier. He's telling us that he made some errors in what he told us, and we need to make some changes. So rather than focus so much on the boring part of manipulating software, it's always tying this to what the nurses care about, which is health care of the patients that are under their care. So it always starts there, so that's the context. You have a patient, and this thing has happened, and you need to reflect that. And then here's the challenge is I'm presenting you the screens of the software, and you've got to do it. Notice that there isn't a big tour or a big lecture about watch me while I do it or follow along with these steps that sort of build mindless following of prompts. I have to just start doing it. If I click in the wrong spots, I just get some messages that say, no, try again. If I make too many errors, it gives me help to say, you know, maybe you want to ask for a hint or look at a demo. So up here at the top, this little yellow stripe is the lesson part of this interface. And I can roll over the hint button, and there it tells me exactly what I should do. It sort of highlights it on the screen. So if I'm really lost, that's going to tell me what I should do. If that's not enough, I could actually go to the demo this step button, and you can see a animation runs that shows what the learner does. I have to do these things on my own, and as I finally do them and prove that I'm competent, and it moves along in the steps. But here the context is two things. One is the context of the person who needs this, and then the context of the software. So we're not adding additional prompts. We're not adding additional a green boxes saying click here now, which so often I see in software training. Well, that's adding an unrealistic fake context that nobody can ever recreate. And so it's unlikely that's going to transfer to the real world. So that's another example of this CCAF. And so, you know, I've showed a couple examples and you may think, well, why is this sort of rare? And there's three impediments. You know, the tools that we have, we already sort of talked about that, what design approach you take, and the expectations. Just want to raise these up real quickly. And the problem with tools is that most tools are structured around a tell and then test approach to this. And often they've sacrificed utility for simplicity. And worst of all, they are moving from poorly thought out content sources like PowerPoint and think all we need to do is translate that. And those are fundamentally flawed ways of going about creating a good tool. And oftentimes if you're building strictly from templates, a template essentially says context doesn't matter because we're providing a generic context, and regardless of what content you're teaching, we're going to shoehorn it into the same format. Now, the design approach that can affect this is so many of us are burdened and bound by the ADDIE linear model of creating storyboards that then gets translated into interactive e-learning. The problem with that is storyboards are a particularly poor way to represent interactivity. They're a much better documentation tool, but they don't really illustrate the give and take and flow of an interactive and variable approach. I mean, imagine if you had to write a storyboard for that railroad example. It'd be absurd to try to think how to capture that. And so what we do instead is we do prototypes. But at any rate, if we're locked into the storyboarding approach, we're never going to get out of that kind of linear telling model of design. And then finally, the expectations. I think some of our organizations have unreasonable rapid e-learning expectations. I've had people come to me and say, yeah, we allow 2 days to build an e-learning lesson. Well, if you're going to do that, there's really nothing you can do except run as fast as you can to get information onto the screen and say you're done. And so it doesn't have to be out of hand, but there has to be a minimal level of expectation that e-learning does take some specialized skill and some time. And I think also we're very used to designing for instructor-led training where actually much of the training happens because the instructors are good. And when we move to e-learning, the instructor's out of the picture. And so we've got to build that flexibility and interest in, and that can be costly. So that's some of the hurdles there. Now, I've got time for one more example, and Carrie might have some other questions that I can answer, but we want to have your input in deciding which would be the most useful example to show as we wrap up.
Yeah, so I'm just going to launch that quick here, and you can pick which demo you'd prefer to see. So go ahead and take a minute here to answer that. One of the questions here, Ethan, is what tool do you use to do prototyping in, or what tool would you suggest to do prototyping in?
Yeah, well, the main thing is to use a tool that you know very well and is not going to get in the way of illustrating ideas. We have some of our designers prototyping in PowerPoint. You can do quite a bit just by using the animation and display features within there. Now, you wouldn't necessarily want to deliver it that way, but it's enough to illustrate. I actually have been using Authorware. I know that that's a tool that's no longer available, but I still have it on my machine, and I still have those skills, and it's a great way to put things together quickly. We're also shifting to do almost all our prototyping now in Zebra's apps because it is so straightforward and makes it very easy to create interactivity. I know some other people have prototyped in Dreamweaver. What I would recommend not doing is prototyping in a tool like Flash because it takes a lot of effort to make Flash work a particular way, and then it's difficult to change. And you don't want to be in a position, I'm not changing my design idea simply because I don't know how to change the prototype. So you don't want to become a victim of your prototypes. So those are the tools we tend to use.
And the tool that he was mentioning again was Zebra Zaps, and so we can send out a link to that too for anybody that has questions around that. That's kind of coming up a lot. And so it looks like the demo that won out was the customer service and consulting demo.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm happy. This is one of my very favorite examples that Allen Interactions has ever created. This was done for Expedia a few years ago, and they really wanted to improve the customer service that they were delivering for people calling up to have assistance with their travel plans. And I didn't actually realize this because I always just make my own reservations with Expedia. But they have a whole staff of people they want to help you plan your trips. But they had a little problem is that they're out in Seattle and they hire people, young people from all around the world to man the phones, but they have to answer very detailed questions about some of the destinations. And the vast majority of their trips are either New York, Las Vegas, or Orlando. And so they wanted to really increase the destination knowledge and then how that translates to improving customer service with their sales employees. So they created this simulation, and this is the third phase. The first two were more of a knowledge base, how to build your knowledge of what hotels, what areas, what attractions there are in New York City in this version. And now we're in the final exercise, which is called building the dream vacation. And what happens is you are put into a phone call. So you can see all the context stuff coming into play right away. We're on the phone with Mary Beth, and she's the first of 5 customers I'm going to have to deal with. I have some information on her profile that I've gleaned from talking to her. She's from Watertown, South Dakota. She's visiting New York for the first time with her husband and kids. She wants a 3-star boutique hotel, maybe with a suite, and she wants to see the sights with her kids. And then I can click on the tab that gives us some quotes to give us insight into what kind of person she is. So I can't wait to slip away on my own and go shopping. I just upped my visa limit. Any ideas? I'm worried about it being too loud and crowded at night. And my husband wants to be able to do his daily jog without dodging crazy taxi drivers. So there's a lot of useful information there, but I have to be a little insightful to look behind her words to see what really would be satisfying her desires. So my task is to pick a hotel, car, attractions for them to see, some must-do items, and some must-see places. So first of all, I'm going to look around for a hotel. I know that most people like to go to Midtown, so I'm just going to pick a hotel that's centered to the Sheraton. That's a good family hotel. So when I make that selection, it gets filled into a postcard here on the edge of the screen. I need to pick a car. I think they're from rural America. They're used to having control over their own driving, so let's give them a minivan for those kids. Let's see, attractions. The kids will love going to the Empire State Building. But you can see that there's a lot of different choices, and these are things I was already made familiar with those scavenger hunt parts of the previous modules. Must do. Oh, she wants to go shopping. She got her visa limit up, so we better give her that. And must see consent of the Natural History Museum. So I could go back and change these. This is, I could keep evaluating what I think Mary Beth would like. But when I think I have all my choices correct, I'm going to go ahead and book this trip. So my actions, you can see, are exploring the city, making choices, and now my feedback is going to come through postcards that Mary Beth has sent me. So I can read these postcards here about the hotel. She's saying, unfortunately, this area didn't quite work for us. We wanted someplace quiet and close to Central Park, although not right on the park. We've heard the Upper West Side is nice. Okay, well, I've got to use that information. I'm going to have to correct that in a moment. Let's take a look at the car. They're going to like that. Uh-oh. Why in the world did you tell us to rent a car? Parking was like $1,000 a day. Traffic was a nightmare. And Tessa suspected that cabbies drive like Al Unser Jr.'s strange twin brother. Okay, so there's another one I got to fix. See, I got thumbs down on these. They're going to like the Empire State Building, I think, though. Yeah, that was cool. The kids were amazed. She liked her shopping trip. Thanks for the tip. I finally got a chance to slip away and went wild buying clothes on Fifth Avenue. And must see. We love the museum, huge collection of exhibits, lots of things for kids to see. They love the dinosaurs. I hope you can see how, again, these feedback messages are in context, but they're just loaded with content. Like, so somebody someday will ask, I want to take my kids to dinosaurs. Well, I'm going to be able to remember and know, oh, I read about that with that history museum. But in order to finish this, I have to change my trip to get those thumbs down into thumbs up. So let's go back to the hotel and say where they wanted to be in the Upper West Side. So let's go up there and see the hotels, and I can reconfer with her profile. She wants a 3-star boutique hotel with a suite. Sure enough, in the Belle Claire is close to Central Park, the Natural History Museum, well-priced suites convenient for families. Bingo, we got that one. And car, guess we'll have them take taxi cabs and so forth. You can see that they changed over here on my postcards. We'll book that, get her feedback. And now she's happy. Just wanted to thank you. We enjoyed our suite at the Belfair. The hotel was only a few blocks from the Natural History Museum and an easy subway ride to Midtown. That was a perfect neighborhood, not too crowded, and my husband loved jogging in Central Park. And then finally, the car. Thanks for not suggesting we rent a car. It would have been crazy to drive places in Manhattan. So now I've got all of her things satisfied. I'm finished, and it ends with a letter. So it's making that full reinforcement of the whole reason that you're doing this as a customer service person is to satisfy the customer. And she writes this nice letter, "Dear friend, thank you so much for all your help. We all had a ball, and I slipped away from my Fifth Avenue shopping spree without feeling too guilty. Can't wait to show the girls back at home. And we appreciate your great tips and things to do. Warm regards." Now, I know I'm a complete pushover on this kind of thing, but after I spent that effort and was really caring about Mary Beth, and I get this letter and she says, "Warm regards," I get a little tick of pleasure in saying, wow, I did something nice, I satisfied that. And I think that's only possible because this created such a rich, realistic environment for me to be applying these ideas. So anyway, that's that example. And I hope, again, you can see how the context, the challenge, the action, and the feedback worked so well together. It's followed up with another example. Here's a guy who's he's a businessman. He's coming to town for a convention. He's got a lot of heavy things, and he's got staff he wants to entertain. So you can imagine the different choices I would have to make in that situation. So where does that leave us? Any other questions questions that you want my answer to, Carrie?
There was a question about video. And how does that, I mean, what is your opinion on video?
Well, I think video, it does an amazing job of creating connection and emotion when that's really at the root of the problem. I don't think it's a particularly good way to convey information just as a delivery mechanism. If you want to show a real-time process, you want to show a complicated setup that has some physical, visual, spatial complexity that a flat picture or an animation wouldn't show. I think those things are great. I think if you want to depict anger or emotion in a conversation, you want to have that vocal tone. I do think sometimes you can achieve that through narration without the overhead of video, because the downside is video is very expensive to create, and it's really expensive to change, and it's not very interactive because you usually sit and watch video passively. So unless you have one of those really specific reasons for using it, we tend to not think it's worth the money. But again, it's always balancing your resources and your time and the need for it to be updated eventually.
Okay.
Okay? Well, as we're wrapping up here, just to let you know there's some resources. We hope you continue beyond just this hour. There's a white paper that's called Creating E-Learning That Makes a Difference that I wrote a little while ago. You can download that from our website if you go to alleninteractions.com. You'll find some of these examples and some others described in more detail. And then I really do encourage you to go to our website to look at these demos. That travel one's there, the train one is there, and a host of other ones. The police security one that show a wide range of how interactivity can impact your designs. As Carrie said, we also teach the e-learning instructional design program for ASTD. You can go to our website or to ASTD to look into those schedules if you're interested in taking one of those two-day workshops. They're live and online, offered both ways. And finally, Michael Allen, our CEO and founder and one of the leading minds in e-learning, has a number of books out. This General Guide to E-Learning has been very popular for several years. It's one of the leading books about e-learning. And then this library of e-learning books, soon to be 6-part, but the first 3 are out, deal with more specific issues of design, of the successive approximation process of creating e-learning, and then about interface design. So I would encourage you to look into any of those as well. And finally, you can reach me at my email here, eedwards@alleninteractions.com. And we have a blog for Allen Interactions, and I contribute regularly, and some of my colleagues do as well. And so encourage you to participate there.
Thank you, Ethan. And any questions we didn't get to, we'll be following up, and Ethan will be giving some answers to a lot of those questions. So if you didn't get an answer to your question, we'll be sending that through email, as well as links to everything that Ethan just covered in the resources section, and the webinar recording, as well as access to the slides. So thank you, everybody, so much for staying with us this hour, and have a great rest of the afternoon.